In all his years of television, Steve Harvey had never seen the room hold its breath quite like this. The board stood lit and waiting, the kind of bright, expectant glow that usually promised laughter or disbelief. Families leaned forward at their podiums. The audience buzzed with the low murmur of anticipation that always came before a fast money round. It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to move fast. It was supposed to end with jokes and cheers and a tidy wrap to another ordinary episode. But something in the air felt different. At the far end of the stage stood an 82-year-old grandmother named Margaret, her hands folded neatly in front of her, posture straight but relaxed, eyes calm in a way that didn't belong to television pressure. Her gray hair was brushed back carefully, silver catching the studio lights. She wore a soft cardigan over a simple dress, the kind of outfit chosen not to impress, but to feel like herself. Around her, her family hovered with a mix of pride and nervous energy, unsure whether to laugh or pray. Steve watched her closely. He had joked with her earlier, gently, the way he always did with older contestants. He had asked her age twice, pretending he didn't hear it the first time, and she had smiled with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to know when humor was kindness in disguise. The audience had loved her instantly. But now, standing alone for fast money, Margaret wasn't smiling. She was focused. Steve raised the card in his hand, but he didn't read the question right away. He looked at her first, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You ready, Miss Margaret?" he asked, his voice warm but curious. She nodded once. "I've been ready a long time," she said. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, but Steve paused. Something about the way she said it, quiet, certain, made the joke land differently. This wasn't bravado. This was history speaking. The buzzer sounded. Margaret answered the first question without hesitation. Her voice was steady, clear, unshaken by the lights or the crowd. The board flipped, a high number. The audience reacted with surprised applause, but Margaret didn't. She didn't pump her fist. She didn't laugh. She simply nodded, as if the answer had always been there, waiting. Steve glanced at the board, then back at her. His smile widened, curiosity sharpening behind it. "All right now," he said. "Let's keep going." The second question came. Again, no pause. Again, no nerves. Her answer came from somewhere deep and practiced, shaped by decades of living, listening, and paying attention. The board revealed another strong score. The laughter faded. The applause softened into something more reverent. By the third question, the room had shifted. The audience wasn't reacting anymore. They were watching, leaning forward, counting silently. Family members pressed hands together, eyes wide, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might break whatever rhythm had taken hold. Steve stopped joking. He stood very still, card lowered, eyes locked on Margaret like he was witnessing something he didn't fully understand yet. He had hosted thousands of these rounds. He knew the patterns. He knew how quickly things could fall apart. And yet, here was this grandmother, 82 years old, moving through the questions like she had rehearsed them her whole life. Another answer. Another high score. A murmur swept through the crowd, disbelief giving way to awe. Steve shook his head slowly, lips parted, the beginnings of a smile frozen in place. "Hold on now," he said softly, not to her, but to the moment itself. Margaret finally glanced up at him then. "Is that good?" she asked. The audience laughed, but it was tender laughter, the kind that comes when humility meets excellence. Steve let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's real good." The fourth question came. This one usually tripped people up. It required instinct, not memory. Guesswork. Luck. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in recall. When she opened them, she answered with quiet confidence. The board flipped. The number was higher than anyone expected. The audience gasped. Steve took a step back, hand over his mouth now, disbelief written plainly across his face. "No," he said, laughing softly, almost to himself. "No, no, no." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Did I say it wrong?" she asked. Steve looked at her, eyes shining. "No, ma'am," he said. "You said it exactly right." The final question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. The family clutched each other. The audience had gone completely silent now, as if sound itself might interfere with what was unfolding. Steve held the card, but didn't read it yet. He looked at Margaret for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I've lived a long life," she said. "This ain't the hardest thing I've done." The words landed with unexpected weight. Steve swallowed, then read the final question. Margaret answered. The buzzer sounded, and as Steve turned toward the board, the entire studio held its breath, because everyone could feel it now. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was a lifetime, distilled into answers. The board revealed the final number slowly, almost reluctantly, as if it understood the responsibility of what it was about to confirm. The audience erupted, but not into chaos, into disbelief wrapped in joy. Hands flew to mouths. People stood without realizing they were standing. A sound rose from the room that wasn't quite cheering and wasn't quite crying, something in between, something human and unfiltered. Steve Harvey didn't move. He stared at the board, then at Margaret, then back at the board again, like his eyes were trying to reconcile two realities at once. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Finally, he let out a soft laugh, shaking his head in wonder. "Miss Margaret," he said slowly, "do you know what you just did?" Margaret looked genuinely unsure. "I answered the questions," she said. "That's what you asked me to do." Steve pressed his lips together, fighting a grin that had grown too big to contain. "You answered every single one of them," he said. "Perfect score." The word perfect echoed louder than the buzzer ever could. The family exploded into tears and laughter at the same time, rushing toward her, careful not to overwhelm her fragile frame. Grandchildren wrapped arms around her waist. A daughter pressed her forehead against Margaret's shoulder, sobbing openly now, years of pride and gratitude pouring out all at once. Margaret stood there, steady as ever, letting it happen. Steve watched them for a moment before stepping closer, lowering his voice so the celebration wouldn't drown out the truth. "How you do that?" he asked her gently. "At 82 years old?" Margaret smiled then, not wide, not triumphant, soft, knowing. "I paid attention," she said. The room quieted again. "I listened to people," she continued. "I worked jobs where you had to know what folks needed before they said it. I raised kids. I buried friends. I lived long enough to learn what matters to most people." Steve nodded slowly, something deep settling into his chest. "That'll do it," he said quietly. The cameras captured the joy, but what they couldn't fully hold was the shift, the way the audience stopped seeing an elderly contestant and started seeing a lifetime, the way laughter gave way to respect, the way the game board suddenly felt small compared to the story standing in front of it. Margaret's grandson wiped his face and laughed. "Grandma been watching this show longer than I've been alive," he said. "She told us, if I ever get on there, I'm gonna win." Steve raised his eyebrows. "She told you that?" "Yes, sir." Steve looked back at Margaret. "You didn't tell me that," he said. She shrugged. "Didn't want to brag." The audience laughed again, but this time it was affectionate, protective, as if everyone in the room had collectively adopted her. Steve turned serious for a moment. "You know," he said, "people think wisdom fades with age. They think life slows down, that the mind dulls, that the world moves past you." Margaret looked at him calmly. "The world moves," she said, "but you don't stop being part of it unless you let it." That answer hit harder than any joke ever could. Steve stepped back, placing a hand over his heart. "I needed to hear that today," he said. Margaret tilted her head. "So did I," she replied. The audience applauded then, not because the moment demanded it, but because gratitude needed somewhere to go. As the family regrouped and the celebration settled, Steve leaned toward Margaret once more. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. She nodded. "Who you playing for?" he asked. Margaret's smile softened. Her eyes glistened just slightly. "My husband," she said. "He passed 5 years ago. We used to watch together. He always said I knew people better than any survey ever could. Steve nodded, understanding in his eyes. He was right. She looked up at the board again, the numbers still glowing. I wish he could see that, she said quietly. Steve smiled, voice steady but full. I think he can. The studio fell into that sacred quiet again, the kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that reminds everyone watching that behind every moment of triumph is a lifetime of ordinary days that made it possible. And in that stillness, one truth stood clear. This wasn't about a perfect score. It was about a life well lived. The applause faded slowly, like a tide retreating, leaving behind something deeper than excitement. Margaret stood at the center of it all, hands folded again, posture unchanged, as if the noise had passed through her rather than landed on her. Steve Harvey watched her the way one watches a quiet miracle, carefully, respectfully, aware that trying to explain it would only shrink it. You all right? He asked softly. She nodded. I'm fine, she said. Just surprised y'all are so surprised. That drew a gentle laugh from the audience, but Steve didn't miss the truth beneath it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Most folks your age, he said, choosing his words with care, don't get this kind of moment. Margaret met his eyes. That ain't because they can't, she replied. It's because people stop asking. The sentence landed like a bell. Steve straightened, the weight of it settling into his chest. He turned toward the audience. Did y'all hear that? He asked, not loudly, not dramatically. Sometimes the problem ain't ability, it's opportunity. Margaret's family gathered around her again, but now they weren't just celebrating, they were listening. A granddaughter squeezed her hand. Grandma, she whispered, why didn't you ever tell us you were this good? Margaret smiled at her. I did, she said. Every day. I showed you. The words hung there, simple and undeniable. Steve felt the moment pulling away from the game, drifting somewhere more meaningful. He let it go. He knew better than to chase it back. This was what happened when you gave wisdom room to breathe. It taught without trying. He asked Margaret to sit for a moment, offering her a chair at the edge of the stage. She accepted, easing down carefully, still composed. The light softened, not by instruction but instinct. The room adjusted itself around her. Can I ask you something else? Steve said. She nodded. What kept you sharp all these years? He asked. What kept you paying attention when life got hard? Margaret thought for a moment. Not long, just long enough to be honest. Curiosity, she said. And love. Steve raised an eyebrow. Love? Yes, she replied. You stop loving people, you stop learning them. And if you stop learning people, you get lost. The audience was quiet again, not out of shock, but recognition. Heads nodded. Some people looked down at their hands, suddenly reflective. Steve smiled. You know, he said, this show asks a lot of questions. But today, you gave a lot of answers we weren't looking for. Margaret chuckled. That happens when you live long enough. The game officially ended soon after, but no one rushed it. The cameras rolled a little longer. The crew waited. The moment had earned its space. Backstage, after the taping, Margaret sat with her family, sipping water, laughter bubbling up in soft waves. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't exhausted. She was present. Steve stopped by quietly. No audience now. No spotlight. I want to thank you, he said. She looked up at him, surprised. For what? For reminding folks that age ain't a curtain call, he said. It's a library. Margaret smiled, eyes warm. Then I hope they keep reading. When the episode aired, people didn't talk about strategy or odds. They talked about Margaret, about their own grandmothers, about missed phone calls and overlooked stories, about how many answers were still sitting quietly at kitchen tables waiting to be asked. Videos circulated, not with captions about a perfect score, but with comments like, I called my grandma after watching this. I sat with my dad and asked him about his childhood. I stopped assuming time had taken something away. Steve read those too. He carried Margaret with him after that, not as a contestant, but as a reminder. That wisdom doesn't shout, it waits. And when you finally listen, it can still surprise you. Because sometimes, television doesn't just entertain. Sometimes, it hands the microphone to a life that's been speaking softly all along. The studio felt different when Margaret finally stood to leave the stage. Not emptied, fulfilled. The lights dimmed slightly as the next taping reset, but something of her presence remained, like warmth left in a chair after someone kind has stood up. Steve Harvey lingered for a moment longer than usual, watching her walk slowly with her family, grandchildren hovering close, hands ready in case she needed support she never asked for. He felt it then, that quiet shift that comes when a moment outgrows its frame. "Y'all all right?" he asked one of the producers softly. They nodded. Everyone nodded. No one needed instructions. The show would go on, but not unchanged. Backstage, Margaret sat while her family buzzed around her, still half disbelieving. A granddaughter knelt in front of her, eyes shining. "Grandma," she said, "you know people all over the country just saw you, right?" Margaret chuckled. "They didn't see me," she replied gently. "They saw themselves. That's why they clapped." The room went quiet. Her daughter sat beside her, holding her hand more tightly than usual. "You never talk like that at home," she said. Margaret squeezed her fingers. "At home, you already know me," she said. "Out there, they needed a reminder." Steve stepped in then. No microphone, no stage voice. Just a man. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, lowering himself to her level again. "You changed the temperature in that room," he said. "You know that?" Margaret tilted her head. "Is that good or bad?" "It's holy," Steve replied. She laughed softly at the word, but didn't dismiss it. "I don't think I did anything special," she said. "I just answered honestly." "That's what made it special," Steve said. "Most people stop doing that once life teaches them it's easier not to." Steve sat with that for a moment, feeling it settle into his bones. He thought about how often he rushed past people, how often television rewarded speed instead of depth. How many Margarets were out there, unseen, unheard, patiently holding answers no one thought to ask. "What do you hope folks take from this?" he asked her. Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at her hands, hands that had held babies, folded laundry, signed condolence cards, waved goodbye more times than she could count. "I hope they ask," she said finally, "before it's too late." The episode aired a week later. The reaction surprised even the network. Viewers didn't just comment, they reflected. Posts appeared from young people who had never watched Family Feud before, sharing clips with captions like, "This is my grandma." Older viewers wrote about feeling invisible until that night. Teachers played the segment in classrooms. Nursing homes streamed it in common rooms, residents pointing at the screen, laughing, nodding, remembering. Steve watched the clip again alone in his office, late at night. He didn't watch the board, he watched Margaret's face, the calm, the certainty, the way she never rushed an answer because she had spent a lifetime learning how to wait. He realized then that the healing hadn't come from winning, it came from being seen, from a woman whose world had slowly shrunk being allowed, just once, to fill a room again. Margaret received letters too, not fan mail, thank you notes, handwritten, messy, honest. From people who said things like, "I didn't know I still mattered until I saw you." Or, "You made me call my mother." She read every one, and each time, she folded them carefully and placed them in a small wooden box beside her bed, not as trophies, but as proof that attention still travels both ways. On her birthday that year, her family surprised her with a cake shaped like the Family Feud board. The numbers were written in frosting. She laughed harder than anyone had heard her laugh in years. "You famous now," her grandson teased. Margaret shook her head. "No," she said. "I was remembered." And that somehow felt better. Time has a way of smoothing moments down, rounding their edges, turning headlines into memories. But some moments resist that softening. They stay sharp not because they were loud, but because they were true. Margaret's perfect score became a statistic on paper. Another win, another episode, another line in a long archive of television history. But the reason people kept returning to it had nothing to do with numbers, it had to do with recognition. In the weeks that followed, something subtle began to happen. Families started sending photos to the show, not of themselves on stage, but of grandparents at kitchen tables, on porches, in recliners by sunny windows. Captions read like confessions. "We never asked her before. He never thought anyone wanted to know. We sat and listened tonight." Steve Harvey noticed it too. During tapings, younger contestants spoke differently about their elders. They mentioned advice they'd ignored, stories they'd finally heard. He found himself asking new questions, not for the game, but for the people. "What'd your mama teach you? What'd your granddad always say?" Sometimes the answers mattered more than the points. Margaret returned to her quiet routines. Morning tea, crossword puzzles, church on Sundays, calls with grandchildren who now asked questions that weren't rushed. She didn't feel famous. She felt useful, seen, included again in the living current of conversation. One afternoon, sitting by her window, she watched a group of children play in the street. Their laughter drifted up, careless and bright. She smiled and thought of her husband, how he used to say the world kept spinning whether you were watching or not. That day on Family Feud, she had watched it spin toward her. Steve sent her a note months later, short, handwritten, the kind he reserved for moments that mattered. "Thank you for reminding us to slow down and listen," she wrote back just as simply. "Thank you for asking." The clip still circulates online now and then, not as viral fuel, as a quiet recommendation. People send it to each other late at night with messages like, "This made me think of you," or "Call your grandma." And sometimes they do, because the legacy of that day wasn't a perfect score. It was permission. Permission to believe that age doesn't erase relevance, that wisdom doesn't expire, that the people who came before us are still carrying answers we haven't learned how to ask for yet. Sometimes television doesn't just entertain, it heals. Sometimes it hands the microphone to a life that has been patiently waiting. And sometimes the most unforgettable moments aren't the loudest ones at all. They're the quiet victories of being seen, finally, after a lifetime of listening.